Hi, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for your time today. I'm, like Justin said, I'm a faculty with the Indian School of Business. I'm very happy to be here. And it's a privilege always to, speak at the NASCOM events. It's a wonderful audience. And like Justin said, I would encourage you to ask me questions. I'll try and look at the screen at the end. So even if I'm not looking at it in the middle, I'll get to it in the end. I do want, some level of interactivity. It just makes it that much more interesting for me as well as for you. I'm going to share my screen at this point and get into the presentation. Shrikant spoke a fair bit about AI, and I'm going to weave that into my talk as well. But I'm going to put that in the context of business. I'm going to talk about how it's helped businesses in the recent pandemic, and I'll also close with implications about what is it that we can do to our respective businesses to leverage it effectively. And I'm not only going to talk about AI. I'm going to talk about a couple of things. And let me start with this. I'm going to kickstart with this quote from many years ago from a revolutionary. Lenin said, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. It seemed to me to characterize the recent pandemic, the recent unfortunate, unprecedented tragedy, both in terms of health as well as economics. That's what it's been. And in this period, we've seen several changes, in behaviors, in business models, in the landscape in which we all operate. We've seen many, many changes. And economists have a term for it. It's called hysteresis. And what hysteresis is that, sometimes when things change, they don't go back to the way they were before, even when the initial conditions return. And I really believe that some element of this change is just that. I don't think we're going to go back completely to an old world. And some of these behaviors are here to stay. And one of the key behaviors that we've seen has been this increased technology adoption. I'm not saying this is an opinion, but if we looked at, for instance, there are two things here that stand out to you. The screen on the left is just how Zoom and Skype have grown in India since the pandemic and since the lockdown. Clearly, remote work has become incredibly mainstream. Many of us in tech and tech services, I study this. Some of you are in the operations of it, and clearly you see that incredible rise, right, in remote tech. Software. This is true. I mean, I've only put up the results for Zoom and Skype, but the whole host of collaborative software that we surveyed organizations on, and the graph looks exactly like this, reflecting these new work habits that we are adopting. The second thing that you can see here is, what this TensorFlow, which Shrikant talked about in his presentation very briefly. It's an open system for building complex ML applications, and its usage too has increased exponentially during this time period. These two point to, there are two shifts that I'm talking about here, and I will also talk about a third shift. But both of these point to the increased use of machines, increased automation, increased use of AI and ML, and getting the machines to do work that we used to, that humans used to do earlier. It also talks about, therefore, changes to work itself, where work doesn't have to be co-located with a physical abstract. It can be separated from this physical office, and it can happen remotely. This is not suitable to all, so we'll get into that a little bit as well. But all of these are characteristics of these three fundamental shifts I want to talk to you about. The first is mind to machine. It is the shift in the locus of decision making from the human mind to machines. An allied shift from product to platform. We used to sell products and services. Today we sell solutions. And because there's been an explosion in data, you don't just have to sell your products. You can bring together an ecosystem which defines a new business model, which is a platform. I'll talk about that. And finally, the work that enables these business models and enables these decisions has also started to shift from being on-site and physically co-located to being remote and technology-enabled. Let's start with mind to machine. Shrikant talked about this, where he said that we're in the midst of the second machine age. And this is a concept that Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee at MIT have postulated. What they say is that, the first machine age was all about getting machines to do the work that humans did. It was about machines replacing human muscle. right? The steam engine came in, the electricity came in, and there was complex factory work, etc., that human muscle used to do, and now the machines would replace it. But now, for the last few decades, we've seen what we call the second machine age, which is not just getting machines to do physical work, but getting them to do cognitive work, to tell them how our brains think and getting them to do that work, right? And a lot of it in the first wave of the second machine age was telling machines to do what we know. The whole burst in computer programming, codifying, right? Writing in great detail what it is that we know. For instance, payroll processing. Human labor used to process these bunches of payroll applications. We programmed it and said, how can payroll be processed at scale? We told a machine to do it. And once that was done, this could be replicated, digitized, and created some incredible economics for payroll, which led to the birth of the Indian IT industry in some sense, right? The entire transaction-intensive business processes outsourcing that we saw. But the limitation, as powerful as that was, the limitation there was, we know much more than we can tell. So even though we told the machines, we programmed them to teach them how cognitive work and what we think, we know much more than we can tell. For instance, you know how to recognize your mother's face. You know how to climb a flight of stairs. You know how to ride a bicycle, but you don't write a detailed program for that. Enter the second machine age, where you don't tell machines what to do, but they learn on their own. So you give them data, you give them outcomes, and then they learn on their own. Srikanth again talked about the games that the computers are learning to play by observation. Things like poker and things like Atari and a bunch of video games. They just pick this up on their own, right? And this has led to, and this is built on the two things, that is machine learning and deep learning, which essentially is which have revolutionized the world in the last few years. And there are many applications of these, but the key ones are sensory applications, vision, sound, then interaction with the physical world, gross motor skills, and the third is cognitive processing. You're probably thinking, what is left? Pretty much not too much. If you look at vision, we've crossed this important threshold. Humans are pretty good at recognizing things. We get 95% of it, we're right. But today, machines have surpassed it. What you're seeing over here on the right is this ImageNet database. Fei Li at Stanford used to host this, and they used to host these ImageNet competition. Is this a muffin? Is this the Chihuahua? What is it? And you used to label these images, and the machines were pretty bad at it. See, they had a 30% error rate. But somewhere where you're seeing this big spike, that's when deep learning started to get incorporated in this, and they just surpassed. And today, vision recognition is at a superhuman performance by the machines. They've surpassed what we do. This, in turn, has led to several advancements. This is not just leading to Facebook understanding who your friends and family are and who they can recommend to you, but it also has implications for medical and medicine and medical diagnostics and a bunch of things. He talked about a couple of applications. This was a really cool paper that was published in Science, where they gave these machines a bunch of radiology reports, and they said, go figure out, which of these have cancer markers. And there are about 12 markers that were identified by scientists and computational scientists over a period of around 10 to 15 years. The machine got it in a few hours. And not just that, they let the machine then continue to run. And the machine not just detected those 12, but 7 additional markers that would help in the early detection of cancer. They ran an impact assessment, and they found that they could improve both survival rates as well as early detection, and the two are correlated, by a significant amount. Right? So these are these are in some sense breathtaking improvements that we are starting to see in the machines and the power of machines. Similarly with sound, right? Again, you see that there is this significant improvement in the performance of the machines with these sensory applications. You've all heard of self-driving cars. It's an example of how we're interacting, how machines interact with the physical world, which is also taking place in factories. He showed you some of these robots, which I thought were very cool, doing somersaults, etc. That's an example of, again, how these machines are getting into factories. And cognitive processing. JP Morgan just designed a year ago something called COIN, which is contract intelligence, doing away with expensive lawyers and 360,000 hours of lawyer time. Here you have the machines which do document review, figure out which documents are most susceptible and vulnerable to litigation, And they found that they're not just in terms of efficiency, they do more than the humans, but even in terms of quality, they surpassed the lawyers. And this, in some sense, is accelerating, right? You see that a lot of these are accelerating. And what this study here, which is by Brynjolfsson and Smith, what they do is, they looked at every single occupation in the United States, and they came up with a susceptibility to machine learning for that occupation. And then what the graph on the left tells you is that every occupation has some tasks that are susceptible to machine learning. It's not that only routine clerical jobs or routine transaction intensive jobs are susceptible to automation. This was the story, by the way, for the bulk of the last 10 years, but ML looks very different. If you line up the wages of these different occupations and look at their susceptibility, all occupations are equally susceptible. It's a flat line. It's not a declining line, right? It's not like, the highest wage percentile is the least and the lowest wage percentile is the most. No, the radiologists are susceptible, the lawyers are susceptible, the regular transaction intensive jobs are susceptible, the factory workers are susceptible. That's what you see over here. So there is a whole bunch. If we say vision, interaction with physical world, and cognitive processing, really, what do we have left? So, in some ways, this is what you see over here. And this has reasonable implications for labor markets. What we did was, which also has implications for this part of the world, is we took these SML scores for India. So, here, this is also available on the Srini website. We took every single occupation in India, and then we developed a score for it in terms of how susceptible is it to machine learning. And then we looked, and this is like a vulnerability index. A VI is vulnerability index. We crafted this at the occupation level, at the sector level, multiple things. And what you see is, here is COVID. And then we said, let's look at the most vulnerable jobs and the least vulnerable jobs. And the jobs that had maximum automation were the least vulnerable. And the ones that were least vulnerable after the pandemic, there was not really any significant change in their economic performance after the pandemic. Similarly over here. But if you looked at the jobs that had very low levels of automation, that were not working with machines, that did not have too much of digitization, those were in some sense the jobs and the sectors that really suffered. Why is it? Because they could not enable remote work. They could not, if labor was not available, they did not have any viable substitute. They could not discern changes in demand patterns. They could not do a bunch of things that technology allowed them to do, leading them to be incredibly vulnerable to the pandemic. And similarly, districts. Here you see this big difference here. The districts that had more number of occupants. So we did this for the Prime Minister's office when they came to us and they said, can you tell us which districts must open up first? And we clearly had this trade-off where we said, you need if there is a high level of human proximity, you cannot open that up. If it has a large number of jobs with high human proximity. But if these districts have jobs where, people can work from home, or there is a lot of digitization, these are districts that can open up. Fair enough, we found that districts with greater number of occupations were more ready to post-lockdown, and they faced fewer disruptions during the lockdown, both economic as well as recovery, right? And this is something that has implications for both economic decline as well as recovery from pandemics and shocks like these. These businesses are essentially more robust, to these kinds of changes. At this point, I'm just going to quickly go back and see if any of you have any questions, and if not, then we'll go back. Is this where I look for it? The attendees stage. Okay, I'm going to go back. The second thing that I want to talk to you about quickly is the shift from, one second, let me also check the time. 4 minutes. The second thing that I want to quickly chat to you about is the shift from product to platform. This large amount of data that comes our way has created these new business models that would be useful for us to think about in the face of these technological changes. If I ask you what is the product of an automobile industry, tell me probably cars, right? But if I tell you that is Uber competition in the automobile industry, you will also probably answer yes. What we're seeing, however, is what traditional automobile manufacturers used to sell was something called a car. What Uber sells is a mobility platform. It's not in the business of acquiring resources that help it manufacture cars and then own these resources, control its supply chain, and then sell them at a lowest price or a differentiated product to consumers. What it is in the business is to get multiple players to, in some sense, the drivers on one side and the riders on the other side, merely link them together through a platform. Of, and you see many examples of this. LinkedIn, which brings together employers, and LinkedIn, which brings together employees. Uber, which brings together drivers and riders. An Airbnb, which brings together hotel owners and renters. So what you're finding is the shift in the digital economy from the traditional product or service to providing a platform. In a platform, you don't own all of these resources that lead you to create the final product. You bring together owners of these products, you bring together the demand of the product, and you, in some sense, connect them together by creating a technology platform as well as protocols for these two sides to interact with each other. The advantage here is rapid scale, right? Platforms grow rapidly. You're investing initially in some sense, bringing an initial set of marquee users on both sides. But once that's done, the platform grows rapidly, and all you're doing is connecting these two parties to interact with each other. This focus here is on demand side economies of scale, not supply side, right? The greater the number of riders, the greater the value of Uber to drivers. The greater the number of drivers, the greater the value of Uber to riders. As opposed to a car manufacturer who's essentially looking at how can I control my supply chain so ruthlessly? How can I control resources so that I can create this product at minimum cost, allowing me to command the best price, which allows me to increase demand, further cut price, and leading to those kinds of monopolies. The parameters that you care about there are very different from this. And that's what you see here, right? So the shift from product to platform is another big change that's happening in the environment around us. If you think about it, the top most 5 valuable companies in the world are all platform companies. And in every sector, we're seeing the emergence of platforms with impunity. The final element that I want to talk to you about is the shift from on-site to remote work. I'm not going to say too much about this, except I'm going to just show you, we did this survey where we found a lot of, evidence about there's a lot of improvement. I just wanted to highlight this, that there's a lot of improvement in productivity, more productive, significantly more productive, about the same. So these three are in some sense. So productivity is at least as high, if not more, than when you do remote work, at least in the survey of 500. We did a survey of about 500 to 700 workers who were working from home. Large bunch of these were in the IT services. So you are seeing a biased sample in that context. But what I thought was interesting was this trade-off, right? At the same time, many of them feel isolated. They feel left out on activities that could build their career. They miss the emotional support of their co-workers. They miss face-to-face contact. They miss out on opportunities to be mentored. So they miss on informal interactions. So I think as we do this, we also need to be thinking about how, as we facilitate remote work, we also need to be thinking about, how do we recreate the elements of on-site work that lead to well-being of the workers, and how do we recreate that either through informal engagement and a bunch of other things. So while productivity is one aspect of it, well-being is another aspect of it that needs to be paid attention to. I wanted to close with just this, which is there are all of these changes that are happening around us. And what we're seeing about AI, what we're talking about technology, this is not the first time that we are seeing these kinds of revolutionary changes. You have a picture here of a factory from many hundreds of years ago. And you see in those days, the factories used to be powered by steam engines. So when you had these steam engines that would generate the power, there were cranks, pulley shafts that were anchored to the engines. And then, that's how factory machines ran. Electricity was invented shortly after, discovered. And then when electricity was invented, what economic historians found that for at least 40 years, the benefits of product electricity did not accrue to the factories. And this was interesting because, if you think about it, 40 years is like a generation of managers takes to retire, right? And for those 40 years, nothing happened. And when they looked back and found what was happening, they found that what factories essentially did was they took out the steam engine and they put in its place this mega electric motor. And every machine used to be connected to this electric motor, and nothing changed in the factories. It was only about 20, 30 years after this discovery that people started to change how work was actually done in factories using the electric motor. And at that point, the big change that happened in factories was that every unit could get its own electric power. You did not have this one big motor from which different machines would draw power. Each individual machine would have its own source of power. And now things started to change, because now you were not organizing factories by which machine needed the most power and you bring that closest to the motor, which is how it was being done in the past. What they started to do was sequence the factories in the order of how work happened. So, whatever task needed to be completed first, you got that first, you got the second task. And that's how you started to organize. And now productivity started to improve significantly, right? And the story of this, the moral of this story is not that electricity was bad, but the moral of the story is that whatever technology innovations come in, our ability to escape from old innovations, escape from old ways of doing things, is what defines how we move into the future. The difficulty is not so much in developing new ideas. I'm sure you were thinking today there are 10 ways in which I can use AI to improve my business. But how am I going to, in some sense, give up my existing value chain and move into this new area, right? So that's where most of the struggle and the angst for companies is. And the way to do that is through experimentation. You cannot perhaps make a big change right at the outset. You cannot move into a new market right at the outset. But you can definitely experiment to see what the future holds, and then use the learnings from those experiments to tune your organization. Because what happens also, the other thing that we do know about every single business in the past is that if most incumbents get disrupted by new business models. And therefore, the way to prevent disruption is reinvention. And how can you reinvent? By the process of continuous experimentation and innovation. So I want to leave you with this, which is powerful technologies are available for machine learning, for facilitating remote work, creating new products and services, all of these. But we have to keep in mind that it takes time for businesses to adapt. And it's important for these kinds of business model innovations for us to be running these experiments. I mean, for me as a university, I'm thinking, will students come into the classroom, or is it going to be that, Coursera and the online learning is the new way? I should be experimenting in that direction. I should be learning what are the ways in which education is being provided online, using those learnings to tune my business model, to say, what is it that I can do offline that those people cannot do online? What is it that they are doing online, and how will the trajectory of the business change? So all of those things are important today for us to think about these things. The workforce needs new skills. If I had one recommendation, it would be to invest in capability development. And winners will be those who can escape from old ideas. This is a graph of all so we did this for the economic survey for the Chief Economic Advisor's Office last year. It's a chapter on dwarfs and giants, where we profiled all of the businesses. And this, most of these small and medium businesses are small. They rely, they are in the informal sector. They suffer from limited scalability. One element of that, to change that, is of course government regulations, to ease compliance laws, to make bring in labor reform. But what can we do? We can invest in human development. we can invest in these technologies that allow us to scale the business. And we cannot scale it unless we scale ourselves, which is to invest in human development, both for ourselves and for at least the people in the organization who lead growth and who lead, in some sense, who lead change. It becomes very important to invest in those kinds of efforts. I'm going to close with that. And if you have questions.
I think we've run out of time.
Run out of time? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Deepa, for that brilliant presentation and for your insightful inputs.